as he said, I am a physicist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So by going into this field, I am sort of stepping away from what I've been trained to do, at least academically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this talk more focused on my personal experience, because as I said, I'm not an expert in this field from an academic perspective, and I would not want to step way outside of my bounds. So I'm going to begin by showing you this map. This is 1805, South Asia. Of course, you can see Punjab. There's no color there. This is a British map. What's really interesting to note here is the brown areas. That's British India in 1805. That's about 200 years ago. This map, this is right before partition in 1947. Now, often what I found really intriguing, so for me, I'll quickly say, this project has been really eye-opening because partition education is not really included in world history or South Asian history in India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh for that matter. Whenever people study about it, it's usually from the perspective of nation states, the few leaders that were around at the time from the British perspective, but not really from the people's perspective, and I'm going to talk more about that and what drove us to do this work. But anyway, what's interesting about this map is that you see the lighter areas, that's British India in 1947. The darker areas, those are the independent kingdoms. Now, of course, they're not totally independent. They have treaties with the British. They have peace treaties where the British are going to protect them and will not, invade their territory. But they're still largely independent. So when we think of British India, when I thought of British India before I embarked on this project, I thought of this giant landmass that was British India that was divided into three pieces, but that's actually not the case. In fact, there were way more pieces before 1947. And of course, there was an intriguing history that sort of disappeared into, and is slowly disappearing into the black hole. There was the Nizams, and there was the Maharajas and ancient dynasties. So here's the Maharaja of Jodhpur. It's one of the most ancient dynasties in India. I guess their family had been in power for almost 2,000 years. And then you have Maharaja Patiala. Everybody knows Maharaja Patiala, Bhupinder Singh. He was, I guess, the leader of the Chamber of Princes in British India. And there's some fascinating stories that go along with his kingdom that have sort of disappeared off into a black hole that you might find in some little book in Patiala when you go there. Then, of course, you have the Nizam of Hyderabad, the wealthiest man in the world before partition. And so here's a map that I found that shows some of the major migrations that happened after 1947. Now, what happened in 1947? There's a lot of debate still about how to interpret the events of 1947. There's still the whole, well, it was the British. No, well, it was the South Asians who had all these wild ideas and no one could agree. My personal thing, the only thing I have to say from the research that I've done, and again, I'm not an expert in this field, is that the British had the upper hand. They had the power, they had the weapons to enforce what they wanted to, or at least, well, they were pretty weak in 1947, which is why they left. But in the end, the Radcliffe line, who drew the Radcliffe line, and who enforced the Radcliffe line? So here's a small map showing migrations of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims in and out of India, Pakistan, East and West Pakistan at the time. Now, what's not shown in this map is that, and what's not generally talked about, is that the migrations actually spanned a much bigger area geographically, which is something that we're discovering from our stories. You actually have people who migrated from every part of India, all the way from Afghanistan to Burma was affected by partition. And a lot of those stories are left out of the general discourse on partition. So here are the numbers that are generally agreed upon. The number displaced in 1947 was 14.5 million. The reason I wrote it out like this is because that's a really, really big number. That's like bigger than countries in Europe. The lives lost, people still don't agree on this. There's people who try to belittle this amount. There's people who try to exaggerate this amount. But these are numbers, and I think what's really important is that the individual stories, which really help us understand what this event is all about, are kind of washed out when you throw around these numbers. I mean, the numbers are really important too, because they kind of give you a glimpse at the scale of this event. Like today, for example, we know from research, the most recent research, the number displaced is actually 25 million people have displaced. So this is also after partition. In the next decade following partition, there were people who left their homeland. And this is not like today, we are just moving around from state to state. We're kind of used to migration because our parents came here, maybe we came here. But this is people who had been living in their villages. They had legacies in their villages that went back maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 years. They'd been living there for ages. Oh, and as far as the lives lost, today the number is still not agreed upon, so we still don't know. So what does it all mean? That's kind of the question that had been haunting me since I learned my own family's history. My grandmother told me about the journey that she took from Lahore and with my grandfather and my dad and his siblings. And I was a teenager when I really learned the details of that. And I was in the US, and at the time we were learning about the Holocaust. For 6 months in school, we learned about the Holocaust. People didn't know about partition. And when I talked about it, they were like, oh yeah, probably nothing big, And so it was really bothering me for all these years. And I was a teenager, I didn't really know what to do about it. And as I got older, I started to research on my own on the internet as the internet got more and more prevalent. And I couldn't find as much information about it. Of course, there was books, but I wanted to hear people's stories. I wanted to know what happened in X village in Rawalpindi district, what happened in Bangladesh, in Assam. And so in 2008, I was doing research in physics, of course, in Tokyo for a few months. And I took a small trip to Hiroshima. I was really interested in seeing the Peace Memorial there. And here's a photograph of the Peace Memorial. And on the bottom right is me in Japan. So they've actually saved the structure next to the Peace Memorial as a memory of what happened during the bombing of Hiroshima. And what they have there really inspired me. They have a library, an archive of testimonies, survivor testimonies. And when you watch these stories, I had read books on Hiroshima, I had watched movies on Hiroshima, and definitely I knew it was devastating. But when I watched these stories and I heard it from the people who experienced it, that's when I realized the importance of actually listening from the source. It was very, very powerful to hear it directly from them. You could really feel and understand, wow, like if you went through Hiroshima and you survived, you can never marry again. Your life is completely destroyed. No one will hire you because apparently, you're gonna have all these genetic problems now. And so I realized that people needed to hear from my grandmother and from other grandmothers and from other grandfathers, other people who had gone through partition. People needed to hear directly from them. And that's when it really clicked. So of course, that was 2008. I came back and I was thinking, okay, well, no one's done this for partition. What to do? Oh, maybe I'll start. I had a little camcorder. It was 10 years old. I really enjoyed filming things. And so I went to India 2009. 2008, I went to India. I told my relatives, and they were just like, yeah, okay, khana thanda ho raha, eat. So it didn't really fly so well. But in 2009, I was pretty determined that when I went back to India, I was in Faridkot, staying with my mamaji and my nani. And one day, they were all out, and I decided that I wanted to go to the bookstore. When I went to the bookstore, the owner of the bookstore, I told him about this idea, and he happened to be a partition survivor. And he was like, oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, let's start right now. And somebody walked in the store, and he was like, oh, what are you talking about? And we were like, we were talking about this. He's like, oh, come over and interview my parents. So I went home that day, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go interview this person's parents. So I went, and I did it, and suddenly, all my relatives started to take me very seriously, and my uncles came on board. They're like, oh, we can find you more interviews, many better interviews, this, and they got kind of competitive. So it started from there, and 2009 was very busy for me. I was graduating with my PhD, not sleeping. Moved to the Bay Area in 2009 at the end of my PhD. 2010, I was visiting in January my grandmother's brother. He was 95. He was living in Anandpur Sahib. And I didn't have my camera with me that day. And he said, don't worry, next time you come to India, I'm going to tell you the whole story. He was 30 during partition. And so I was like, okay. But in June of that year, he actually passed away. And so I was never able to go back and get the story. And he was the last surviving relative from that age group in my family. And suddenly, for that whole week, I mean, not only was it a loss of a family member, but it was also a loss of knowledge that I guess in the old days used to get passed down, but suddenly, you know, because of our modern life, there was this block. And I couldn't sleep that whole week, and I was like, I know I have to do this, and I don't really know anyone in the Bay Area, but I'm just gonna stick my neck out and go out there. So I showed up at Fremont Gurdwara. You know, some of the committee members thought I was really weird, and some of them were some of them were supportive. And there was a lady on the committee, and she said, okay, you put a table over there and put a sign up, and if anyone says anything, you know, you come and tell them that I told you to do this. And I was like, okay. So I put a sign up, and lo and behold, 20 people signed up that first day, and I realized that it was important to others as well to preserve this, not just me. And of course, you know, things only happen when there's a need for it. And so that's where it started, and we ended up getting a lot of volunteers on board. Some of them were in the audience from the SSA. That was actually the first organization on Berkeley campus that I started to annoy with my ideas, and they were very gracious. And some of them came on board, and we started collecting stories. Last year, 78 people, 78 volunteers helped collect 450 stories. They range between 1 and 4 hours, cover everything from rural farming practices, pre-partition, to pre-partition weddings, culture, just in general, you know, like festivals that used to exist back then, and inter-community relations, which are really interesting because it seems like people did not differentiate themselves based on religion as much in the rural areas, very different in the cities. So now I'm going to quickly go through some of the things that I've learned in my personal journey. There's a great, if you go to our Facebook page, I don't have any slide on here advertising that, but you can probably find us online. You'll see a lot of stories from a lot of other volunteers. You'll also see blogs from other volunteers, and they're absolutely fabulous and fascinating, so I encourage you to go online and read their experiences. I also quickly want to mention what our process is for doing this. So the first interviews I did, they were definitely very amateur, but I knew better. I was in academia, so when I was at Berkeley and I got this thought, I decided, well, Berkeley has one of the greatest regional oral history offices. It's got a really huge oral history department. So I went over there, and Dr. Lisa Rubin, she took me in, and we developed an entire procedure packet. I learned how to do this, trained myself, and then trained others how to do this. We also got a number of other faculty from Berkeley on board to advise us and help us go through this whole process. So here on the left-hand side is one of our meetings. We have training sessions. We train volunteers. It's actually public now. We do them at the Berkeley Public Library. And soon, we're going to put these training videos online so anyone anywhere in the world can learn to do oral histories. And on the right-hand side, you see a photograph of us. That's one of our typical outreach events. This is, I believe, in the Fresno area. Actually, this is the Selma Gurdwara. So we're tabling at the Nagar Kirtan there and trying to sign up people to collect stories. So we did this almost every other weekend, all of 2011. And so then what happens is we actually go to the interviewee's home because that is the most comfortable place that they can open up. And of course, we don't want to put them through too much trouble, also given their age. So this is our volunteer, Gurvinder, and she's conducting an interview somewhere, Castro Valley, actually. That's where it was. So now I'm going to quickly go into the experience. This is one of my first interviews. So what was really neat for me was I had also only heard the story of partition from the Sikh Punjabi perspective, because that was my community. And it was really neat for me to step out of my community. And here I'm interviewing Dr. Siddiqui, who was also he's an electrical engineer, but his work was very close to what I do in physics. And he's a sitarist. He lives in the Bay Area. And he's from Hyderabad. And he moved to Lahore, which is where my family moved from. So it was very fascinating for me to hear a perspective of someone who actually moved to Lahore. and was learning Punjabi. This is me with Dr. Siddiqui and his wife. So what's really neat, what ends up happening often, and this is one of my favorite parts of doing this, is that not only do the stories get recorded, but often these stories have not been heard by the family. So now they're also preserved with the family during this. I mean, sometimes what happens is you have the younger generation who's like, oh, I don't, because grandpa is from another culture and they don't really understand where grandpa is coming from. And suddenly you have these people coming in, giving importance to their story, and suddenly the younger generations are really interested, and they even end up joining, coming on board and starting to collect stories. So this is one case where everybody got really interested in grandpa's story. This is the person that I've interviewed who was the oldest during partition. He was in his 40s. He's now over 100 years old. And it was absolutely fascinating to hear him talk about life back then, especially rural life. He talked to us about cotton, all the different kinds of the kapa and the different ways of, different kinds of cotton that they used to grow back then, and how they never actually went anywhere to buy cloth. Everything was done in the village. They grew the cotton, then they made the thread in the village, they made the cloth, so everything was organic, everything was made in the village. And he actually was a tailor. So he was the one who was sewing everybody's clothes in the village. And he still sews. He's over 100 and he still sews. And he loves doing that. So here is, does anybody know who that person is on the extreme right? It's a very intriguing Punjabi personality, but because of this divide we call partition, we haven't heard of him in Indian Punjab. He's from Pakistani Punjab. So the gentleman in the red turban, that's Dr. Hardev Virk. He's a physicist from Indian Punjab. And right next to him is Dr. Abdus Salam. Does anyone know who that is? Yeah, so he's the only Punjabi physicist to win a Nobel Prize, but he's from Pakistan. And of course, there are other Nobel laureates there too in this photograph. So yeah, this is just a random picture. This work takes you to places that you may never go to, and it takes you to homes and to experience cultures that you never would. This is just on our way to Central Valley, which to me was absolutely fascinating to see Central Valley in California. Coming from Florida, where I grew up in, I was like the only Indian person, and to go to Central Valley and actually see like datas, but they've adapted to like American culture, and they've got their Hummers and tractors, and it's really interesting. So our core belief is that all communities affected must come together to build a partition archive. You can't just have one community. You have to have the Sikhs, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Jews, the Christians. We get calls from Israel. We've gotten calls from Israel of Indian Jews who used to live in Lahore and Karachi who had to move due to partition. So that's pretty fascinating in itself. And sometimes this project has forced me to step outside of my bounds. Like when I first started, of course, it was easy to approach the Sikh Punjabi community, because that was my community. And then how to break into the Sindhi community. So I had talked to a number of Sindhi elders, and they were always very skeptical. And finally, they were like, why don't you come to this event and dance with us? So, a number of us went to their event. There's a famous Sindhi musician, I don't remember her name, and she actually has a Punjabi Sikh tabla player that she plays with and travels with. So we were at the Sindhi event, and we got to know a number of Sindhi elders, and they were, after meeting them and seeing that we're not crazy, they decided to share their stories. And that is a fascinating story in itself. Like, I learned how huge Sikhi is in the Sindhi community, which is something that is almost completely unknown in our community, at least in my generation. They're huge followers of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. And actually, they probably do more part than most Sikh Punjabis that I know. So that was very fascinating. And of course, as part of the plurality, we have a fabulous volunteer, Farhana. She's actually a software engineer based in the Bay Area, but she's originally from Bangladesh, and she has been collecting stories in Bangladesh. She just came back, took a break. She has 2 little children, but she took a vacation, went to Bangladesh and collected 52 stories. So that's Farhana again. And so this was very exciting for us. The Citizens Archive of Pakistan contacted us after running into our website. And so what they decided to do was build a showcase of our stories in Karachi. And at first I was very skeptical. I was like, oh my gosh, what are they going to do with the stories in Pakistan? You know, okay, let's just see what happens. And it ended up being a very, very beautiful and well-designed display. So here's a young Karachi schoolgirl listening to Mr. Raj Madan, who used to live in Dera Ismail Khan before migrating over to India. And so they wanted specifically videos of people from India who originally lived there. So that was pretty interesting to have that cross-cultural. Do I have time or 2 minutes? Okay, so I'll go through the rest very quickly. So of course this project has taken me to Amritsar. We stayed for a little over a week. In the Harmandir Sahib complex, they have the NRI suites there. And we went shop to shop looking for people who had survived partition. This is Ranjanpreet Nagra. She's one of our volunteers as well. And the people were incredible, just amazing. And just the elders especially. The younger generation was a little bit different because our culture has changed. We have more barriers. And it turned out some of these shops have been there for more than 200 years within the same family. And that's some fascinating history that just has not been touched upon. And of course, we interviewed somebody who was selling rumalas, and his story was really intriguing. And these are people that often don't get a voice within India because of the economic divide in India. And you can see the Golden Temple complex in the back. And this is a gentleman that we interviewed who built himself up from the ground up after partition, and he lives right in front over there. This is in village Jagdev Kala, and what was really fascinating here is that there's an old Sufi Peer, a Muslim Peer, a Fakir, and he, 17th century Fakir who was from this village. And what happened is all the Muslims left in 1947, all the Hindus left in 1984. That's what I don't remember this gentleman's name, he was telling us. But what they did is the Sikhs in this village, they actually put a bunch of money together and they're taking care of the masjid of this fakir, which was really beautiful and really neat to see. One last thing, a fascinating detail I've learned. So I kept hearing these people talk about janglis, especially from district Lalpur and Rawalpindi areas, and I was like, who are these janglis? So some of the people described them as these people who wore these black robes, and it was their land that, I don't know how many of you guys know, but the British, they had started awarding land in West Punjab to people from East Punjab. And the idea was to deforest it and farm and create wealth for the empire. So a lot of people went over from East Punjab to West Punjab, and of course they spoke East Punjabi, and the people over there were called Janglis because they spoke a different dialect of Punjabi, and they were, they did not live in villages, they were sort of nomads. And they apparently wore black robes, they had very light hair, they were very fair-skinned, had light eyes, so it's curious, like, who are these Janglis? I still have no idea who they were, but Jangli is a derogatory term, by the way, so we shouldn't be calling them that, but I don't know who these people were. I think it would be fascinating to learn more. The closest thing I could find was there's the Kalash of Chitral, who they live in the Northwest Frontier Province. They still have these Vedic customs that they follow, according to anthropologists, and they wear these black robes. They have lighter features. Perhaps they were the original inhabitants of West Punjab. So where to from here? We are now opening up our entire project. So we ran our pilot in California. We now have a number of programmers on board, and we are creating a portal where people can get trained online and submit stories to us. And the idea is that we want Partition to be a part of K-12 education globally. And once our main focus right now is to collect the stories, and the next phase will be to educate the world and to have our stories travel to actually create a peace memorial, if possible, in India and Pakistan on the border. And so that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.